What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
Welcome back to San Francisco. Mutual aid groups like the West Side Tenants Association exist because they must. When governments, traditional nonprofits, and obviously corporations, aka the big institutions that structure society in the US right now, when all of these institutions don't do the basic things that we need to survive, like housing people, groups of people must come together, as they always have, to fill in the blanks. West Side Tenants, one of them, helping people move, helping people fundraise to make rent, or showing up when sheriffs come to evict people. A side effect that comes out of this kind of work that isn't tangible, but is important when you think about major problems that people talk a lot about right now, whether it is polarization or social isolation or looming climate disasters, is the meaningful connections between people who live near each other and usually managing to do it without institutional funding. Speaking of funding, if you want to help out a couple of people making a podcast with some of the tech hosting and labor for the editing, please go to patreon.com/San Francisco. That is where you can contribute to the podcast as well as find all of our past episodes. Thank you so much to Noah for being the latest person to do just that. And the conversation with West Side Tenants Association starts right after this break. We are here with the West Side Tenants Association and have E, A, and R. Super stoked for you guys to be here. Thank you to Maddie. Shout out for making the connection. And to start, could you just generally talk about what WSTA does?
Yeah. Hi, y'all. West Side Tenants Association is a group of autonomous tenant organizers who believe that safe and dignified housing is a human right and that land shouldn't be a commodity. Everyone deserves a place to rest. We think that home shouldn't be treated as a commodity that disrupts, displaces, or destroys lives. And we believe in building community by developing our strong relationships with one another. So a thing we constantly say is, if you're facing displacement, you're not alone. And if helpful, I can kind of go into our history and our different projects.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, for surely. So we were originally formed in collaboration with the Housing Rights Committee in 2019. In 2021, we became an autonomous group because I think we really held this desire to separate from the nonprofit industrial complex and also act up in ways that you can't necessarily do when you're a part of a 501c3. After this, we started something called the Eviction Response Network. And this was in response to evictions that we saw occurring during the pandemic moratorium. So back when we had no evictions allowed in San Francisco during the beginning of lockdown. And soon it kind of just became a Bay Area-wide eviction response. So it means that if somebody is experiencing an eviction, we have like 100 plus people on our list will come out and show up for them. And that could come in a variety of ways, right? And we found that a big need was mutual aid. And I think our reflection too is that eviction response is mutual aid in a particular way. And so our mutual aid committee formed as a part of that natural outgrowth. We've redistributed over $60,000 directly to tenants facing eviction, and that's just been through like IG graphics. We've shown up to different eviction sites, so when the sheriff's actively locking folks out, we've helped tenants or elders pack up their homes when they're being evicted. We've helped them move and find new housing. We've door knocked in front of landlords' homes that were actively evicting folks. And
love that.
We for Lunar New Year, we gave them this red envelope with like a note in that they're evicting folks. And then we went and we talked to all their neighbors about how they were evictors in San Jose. And I think a really big outgrowth of WSTA really is like our eviction response network, our tenant group, and our mutual aid and I think to speak on how we define and engage with mutual aid is that we think it's a voluntary, collaborative, reciprocal relationship and exchange of resources, right? Because mutual aid is a part of everything that we do. I think that being in community with one another is to be in mutual relationship, right? And that it's just a centering of our relationships with one another outside of this like capitalist scarcity mindset, and a way that we express our solidarity by creating relationships of care and love and mutual struggle.
I'm so stoked that you guys are in town and hope that there is some kind of organization that uses like a similar model to you all in like any city in the US. SF, of course, for many years has been in the media as like, here's how bad it can get. Here's how bad the housing crisis can get. And obviously, if you have looked at any of the statistics, you know that the housing prices in San Francisco are unusually high and have been for years compared to a lot of other places. But that said, this is not a problem that's specific to San Francisco. The population of people who are unhoused is like up 12%, I want to say, year on year. Before we like get too deep into WSTA's work, before we started recording, y'all mentioned how you operate, which is you have an ethic where in the spirit of collectivity, you all asked to not be named today. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can speak on that a little bit. I like what you mentioned about like kind of this like pedestalizing like a personality or like some type of character. And I think that that really is like rooted in like ego, right? And I think a lot about the ways in which like activism and organizing is perceived, especially in this moment. And it's this really like silly, and it almost seems like complicated and like messy concept to think about, because obviously we want to be able to like feel the movement and to like mobilize people, but then what does it mean to like be genuine and authentic? And I think for WSTA in particular, right, like we had mentioned that we are like an autonomous like housing justice collective, and we practice a horizontal structure where like none of us feel like the need to like represent what WSTA is and what we do. And another thing that we mentioned earlier, right, was like security and wanting to like protect our identity against, you know, scary capitalists is also a bonus.
For sure.
Yeah, I think that also even before our call, like we were having a conversation about what it means to like actually have collective discussions and collective decisions. And I think that like the three of us also hold like a really particular belief that what we say here like is not going to fully encompass everything that WSTA is and like all of our collective worldviews, but we are trying our best.
I love that.
That was great. One thing I think about a lot, this is going to sound silly, but I swear it's going to go somewhere, is that like our generation, I'm 24, and are like similarly aged. And I know I did, and a lot of people my age grew up reading a lot of young adult fiction like The Hunger Games or Harry Potter, or these stories that were crafted around like a main character, and the main character like fights the big bad evil and wins because that main character is like an incredible achiever. I feel like I have that narrative somewhere deep rooted in me about like how we're going to beat capitalism. And there's like some part of my brain that's like, if I just work hard enough, if I'm just good enough, if I'm just smart enough, like I can make change. And I think part of like my desire to like push it into the collectivity is to like, how can I unlearn that thing that I've been taught, right? Because it's not true. Like that is not how change happens. Like we know this from history. We know this from so many movements, and just think about like the fallacies that I've inherited. And that feels like one of them, which feels silly to talk about books, but I know for me, it's a lot of like where I've gained power or something.
No, it's so true. I mean, similarly, what I'm about to say sounds very cheesy to me when I'm saying it, but stories, narratives are like, things that bring meaning to our lives. And so many of the narratives that we get from media in terms of not just the news, but also books, movies, music, there's like, singular individuals that are at the center of those narratives. And absolutely agree. No like major change has come about as a result of one individual acting. It is always many, many people acting in many different ways. And I don't think it sounds corny or whatever. I appreciate being reminded of that. So you came out of the Housing Rights Committee. This is true. Housing Rights Committee. And how many regulars end up showing up to the like collective meetings?
Yeah. I mean, partially, because we are such an organic structure, like we don't have a set number of employees, right? So how many people are involved really changes and grows and shrinks with different projects that we're working on, and also like people's different moods and abilities at different times. Right now, and like sort of most consistently, we've had around 6 organizers who are in our like tenant organizing committee, which is sort of like the main organizing body. Around 20 organizers who are in like the mutual aid group, largely working on distributing funds and eviction response and other things. And then over 100 people, I think it's closer to like 150 that are in our like big ERN signal chat where like if something happens and we need people to respond, that's like who we call on. There's a lot of sort of like different things that we do. Like I actually find it sort of hard to relay it all because we're often doing so many things at once. We have like a bunch of different meetings to just like get things done, but the sort of like big general meetings are once a month on Thursdays at the end of the month. And those are like super open and anyone can come and join us and talk and get to know us and talk about the work we do, and we can get to know you. And it's really like a community building thing too. But yeah, I mean, like I think another question that sort of like came up and that we were thinking about earlier is just like how we actually work, right? Like how do you get people in a room working together, and what does it mean to really be collaborative and to be autonomous? We like were founded as part of HRC, so that meant that there was one West Side organizer that was paid, employed by the Housing Rights Committee, whose job it was to like organize tenants on the west side of San Francisco. And WSTA came out of that. WSTA, which we sometimes belovedly call WSTA, but also sometimes not. So if you hear us say that, it means the same thing.
Got it.
Yeah, I think I was the West Side organizer at one point in time. And so I really, I don't know what it means to work in a nonprofit. I think many of us have had housing related jobs at nonprofits at different times. And I know that I really felt restricted by what we could and couldn't do. And also just by the like emotional availability or what it means to be forced to do something, right? Like, what does it mean that you have to get something done in a day instead of that you're doing it because you want to and because it's meaningful to you? And so we sort of like collectively made a decision to part ways with HRC a few years ago. And I think the organizing has like grown and changed in such incredible ways that have really, really inspired me. And sometimes it's really hard, but I don't know. I think we have like an incredibly beautiful community that would not be possible if we had government or grant funding. So I feel really like proud and grateful all the time.
Amazing. One of my favorite episodes of the podcast for people that want to go back and listen to this conversation that I had with my friend Dean Spade, who has written a bunch about mutual aid and also about the issues of organizing under the like structure of a nonprofit that I can link in the show notes.
I think there's one thing that I want to add is that I feel like I've listened to that episode you have with Dean Spade 3 times because
I listened to it today. It was so good.
We also had a book club where we read that book. So very, very cool.
Reflecting on that conversation that you had with Dean, something that really struck me in that episode is when he was talking about the practical aspects of getting grant funding. At the end of the day, you're going to be prioritizing the well-being of the person who's working because that makes sense is in line with our politic, right? But what does that sacrifice? And when we're particularly focusing on funds, when we're raising funds, most of the time it's for people who are about to be evicted by the sheriff, maybe the very next day, or folks who already have the power turned off in their apartment, or it's a very dire need. And to have to face that question and be in between who is more deserving is an incredibly complex place to be in, especially when we think about power and all of the different isms that come with that, right? And I think that that's a conversation we have a lot in our mutual aid group and within our organizing of what does it even mean to be raising these funds, and this idea of deservingness that we always have to combat, because we're always being told that if we want something, like if you want to qualify for any kind of benefit or something, you have to exploit yourself. Like you have to do so much work to prove yourself as somebody who is deserving of need. And I think it's been really important to us that we never make people feel that way, that they have to immediately come to us and say their entire life story so that they can be heard, so that we can consider that person being deserving of something. Yeah. I think that's just something that I reflect on a lot from that.
I'd like to add something. I think that like what A had just mentioned about like this idea of deservingness and having to like exploit your like intersectional identities to like prove that you deserve support. I'm thinking a lot about like solidarity versus charity. And when you are a so-called nonprofit organizer, like you are bound by literal your funders and your deliverables. Like as A had mentioned, like it's not like a relationship that could actually like foster like real true organizing because you like are working for this organization, you have a W-2 and you have to fill out these programmatic updates like every month. You know what I mean? But it's like mutual aid, right? Like it's rooted in understanding that like we can survive together and really being committed to like interdependence. And so I truly believe that like mutual aid saves lives. Yeah. So just wanted to kind of like close that loop of what A had been talking about. But go ahead.
Yeah, because it's literally like, I think being from the Bay and loving this place and fighting to stay in this place, not only do I want to know my neighbors, but I want us to constantly be in community and relationship with one another. That is something that is actually so natural to us that capitalism works to isolate us, right? And to keep us from forming those relationships with one another. And remember that all of this is just extensions of loving on our community and loving on the people that we're around. It's not about who has it. Like, you need to tell me how bad you have it so that I can feel like, okay, maybe you're worth my time.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, like how awful it is that people under capitalism have to like perform their needs in this sort of way. And, you know, for things like housing, which is, you know, just a very basic, a bare necessity. No one should have to do that. Wanted to know if you feel inspired by any other groups locally, or if there are any groups that you would point to where you have gotten inspiration?
We do. For SF groups that we get inspo from and historical groups we get inspiration from, we really wanted to talk about this just to shout out the intergenerational space that we hold at WSTA. The eviction response network we have is not the first one. It is not the last one. There have been so many that have existed over time throughout the years, right? You can think about the EDN in the 1990s and Dispatches Against Displacement. James Tracy talks about all these different response networks that were created. And throughout San Francisco history, right, there's a long legacy of urban renewal and all these extensions of settler colonial projects that lead to displacement, both here and I would say internationally as well. We draw a lot of our inspiration from the response network that was built out for the iHotel, because two of our movement elders in the space, oh my gosh, if they're listening to this, I'm sorry I said movement elders. I mean, are like wonderful, amazing organizers who teach us from the wealth of experiences that they have. They both participated in the blockade for the iHotel, and one of them was inside supporting a elder as, you know, the sheriff broke in and evicted them that night. And they talked to us a lot about that 9-year-long eviction defense. What did it mean to create blockades and to get thousands of people out by just having a phone tree, asking people to use their relationships with one another and being willing to act up in solidarity with their neighbors to literally blockade doors to keep people housed? And we are so lucky to have them in the space because we learn together and we get to reflect on the rich history of movements that we're pulling off of in San Francisco and the Bay Area. And something that we were really thinking about is right now we're really motivated in action because of what we're seeing in Gaza and because of our connections to Palestine. I think a lot about the idea of displacement here and displacement everywhere, right? That's everything from the microcosm of evictions here to borders disrupting natural flows of ecosystems, all the way to settler colonialism and displacement in Palestine, right? It's this idea and the project of settler colonialism that continually dispossesses Indigenous peoples of their rights to their homes and land. And all of these projects that we're inspired by and that we're learning from, we must see evictions, speculator landlords, and all of these others as part of the settler colonial project. That the work of any anti-displacement project and tenants' rights group, we have to wrestle and hold that we can't do any housing rights work without supporting land back and Indigenous self-determination, both in San Francisco and in Palestine and internationally. Like, our work is empty if we do not understand the roots and the beginnings of displacement in San Francisco. These things like urban renewal, evictions, the idea of landlords, all of this is based on the premise that private property is worth more than human life. And that all extends from this white settler colonial idea that Indigenous folks were not caretakers and stewards of their land. And our movement elders, I think, consistently remind us of that. And I just feel like the work would be very empty and sometimes does feel very empty if we're not based in this understanding.
That was so beautiful and so true. I was like in New York a couple weeks ago, and there was a gathering of real estate professionals who were meeting to discuss how like land in Gaza was going to be like split up and how like basically how they could make money off of people's suffering. And I mean, it was, yeah, just what you said. There are a lot of examples of how like this, like colonization, gentrification are the same at their root. Also, you know, in SF, we obviously have an issue with there being a lot of corporate landlords who own hundreds, even thousands of housing units across the city. Yeah, I was wondering if there are any landlords, whether corporate or individual landlords, that people should sort of keep an eye on.
Yeah, so many villains. All landlords are bastards. We know this. Yeah, so to start, like, I'm just kind of going to state the obvious. Like, as we were discussing earlier, these bureaucratic systems are awful. And I think that there also is this notion that like poor people and low income people can just get all of these like benefits assistance when that's quite literally not how it works. And we also understand that like also being a part of these like benefits assistance programs like inherently perpetuate poverty. And in this case, in like the housing world, the cycle of displacement, especially when like the most marginalized, like working class, low income, like mostly immigrant communities of color are kettled into like supportive housing programs where they have to live below a specific income threshold. And depending on their identities or the socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, sexuality, they will be afforded more or less depending on that. Again, we also recognize that we want affordable housing. We want people to be housed, but also recognizing like how awful the system is as well. But to answer your question about the villains of the housing world, in particular corporate landlords, you might be familiar with this, but there is a list of the worst evictors in the Bay Area. You can look it up with the URL that's literally worstevictorsbayarea.org. And we could also send this link to you to put in the show notes. And I could name a few. So there's Veritas that's owned by Yat Peng O. And Veritas is funded by Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase. What a shocker. Next one is Ballast Investments that's owned by Ryan Brewer. That's funded by the RBC Capital Markets. Another company is Mosser, which has like a bajillion buildings in both San Francisco and Oakland, owned by Charles Mosser, and that is funded by the Silicon Valley Bank, amongst other awful banks. And then to name a few others, there's like Maximus and Trinity. And so these are named like the worst evictors of the Bay Area. Also wanted to touch on like how there are actually 26,000 affordable housing units that are funded by MOHCD, which is the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, and about 1,000, which is 14,000 eviction notices have been issued to tenants, and 2,256 court appearances, and it all led to 1,108 evictions from 2016 to 2020 of affordable housing units within the nonprofit landlord world.
Right. Yeah. And so these nonprofit landlords, they're not at fault in a lot of these cases too. I know that with Mission Housing, which does have some new housing units that have been built over the last few years, that's like great. But the head of Mission Housing is a YIMBY who is an ex-realtor from Florida, Sam Moss, who's married to Laura Foote Clark of YIMBY Action Group here. On Friday, actually, I'm going to be like talking again to Aaron McElroy, who I met organizing way back, like maybe 10 years ago when Google Bus protests had like a moment in the media, and her new book, Silicon Valley Imperialism, I just finished it. It's pretty good. I also wanted to ask, I've worked at nonprofits in the past for sure, where it felt like a lot of the work I was doing was not meaningful. And I was doing busy work, like admin work that felt like it was helping no one, and certainly was not linked to the reason that the nonprofits existed. It wasn't like part of the mission. What's a recent action where you felt like, thank God this exists, stoked that West Side Tenants is around, otherwise this work might not get done? Also, just to give people like a taste of some of the stuff that you all have been up to.
Yeah, there's so many things. I feel like my heart is so warm thinking about it. I'm thinking about our like beautiful, like interpersonal, but also like organizing relationship with Denny, the flower lady, and many of us have like developed a very like familial relationship to Denny. And I'm thinking about how she has been fighting her eviction for years, and how WSTA has and continues to show up for Denny in so many different ways, like her campaign, her eviction defense campaign, and finding her housing through the Flower Alliance, moving her out of her home into her new home, driving her to her doctor's appointments, and going to live shows with her and dancing and all of these beautiful things. I'm also in particular thinking about a fundraiser that we had organized. I think it was on September 18th. I remember that because it's my birthday month. And we had raised, I believe, over $5,000 in about 3 or 4 hours. I'm really reflecting on something that you said, that like, what is a recent like action or event where you felt like, I'm so glad that, we exist. And that doesn't mean that it needs to be like a positive or like grand memory, because that fundraiser was incredibly stressful, but it was also like incredibly nourishing and like incredibly life-giving to witness so many people come out to support Denny in fighting her eviction. And it really was just so full of joy. And I really felt like the spirit of like solidarity and interdependence. And that was one of like the very first of so many memories where I was like, I'm so happy that I'm here with my comrades and with my besties. Yeah.
Fuck yeah. Stories like this, like I hope that traditional nonprofit housing organizations that are out there, they need to like steal these ideas that you all are putting out into the world. They need to borrow from these models because that is how the solidarity gets built and like continues the work. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it's making me think, oh man, there's like two things. It's making me reflect on what you were speaking about earlier too. Is sometimes there are moments where it does feel really bad. What does it mean that we're paying a landlord's mortgage sometime? Yes, we're showing up for someone to pay their rent for the month. And then also all that money is going straight to this landlord's pocket. And that can feel so devastating in a way too. And frustrating. And I think we really openly talk about struggling with that dynamic, especially as our mutual aid fund grows, right? Like, what is it for? What do we do with it? And how do we reflect on that? And then I think there are moments where I'm reminded that it's always all in service of the relationships that we're building with folks. When I first started coming to WSTA and we were first organizing together, I like randomly got this tenant's phone number while I was walking down the street from Dolores Park, and it was for the tenants at 3661 19th Street who were facing, I believe, their third Ellis Act eviction from their speculator landlords. And this was one of the first campaigns that we had worked on. These tenants ended up not only not being evicted, but we were able to help them get their building bought by MEDA, which was the nonprofit houser that they chose as a tenants association. And it was like a 3-year fight. And I think I just distinctly remember sitting with folks like outside their apartment while folks are gardening, thinking about childcare and just creating and fostering new friendships and like intergenerational relationships, right? And I think that is what it's all about. And what it's always felt for me is that, yes, of course, it's in service of our movement. And then also it's about creating deep relationships with one another, where now every time I walk to Dolores and I see folks, half a block away from Dolores Park and their housing is absolutely everything they asked for, it just feels really beautiful. And it reminds me that we're just trying to keep our folks housed and in the same place and just loving them. Like, I'm so used to the losses, right? I feel like my family was evicted from the mission. I'm so used to that being the narrative, and then being in a place and knowing that we are able to win and we can win big. And it's actually not even the best thing that we can do was so special and beautiful for me. And now we can look at that and remember that that building is going to be permanently affordable housing until the end of time. So I think that has been very special to me.
Yeah, super inspired. E, did you have anything to add?
Yes, because there's so many stories that we could tell, and we're all choosing 2, so we can tell you 6, but we could really tell you like 500 and it wouldn't be enough. Yeah, I got a little teary hearing that. Hey, that was really sweet. I think for me, the relational parts of this work are also the most formative and like grounding, and feel in some ways the most revolutionary and like the biggest wins. I think there's a lot to be said for the amount of money that we've redistributed and how big of an impact that makes on people's lives. But I think to me, the most moving things that we do are like the small, simple acts of service that come as mutual aid that are so, I don't know, just so simple and so impactful. This week, we like spent Saturday morning with a tenant who's being evicted in Park Merced, and we just like helped her get rid of stuff in her kitchen. Like, she was really stressed out about having to pack up her kitchen, and so we just sort of like went through stuff, put it in boxes, hung out, talked to her kid. You could just tell how much it meant to her. And I don't know, it really hit home for me. She really reminded me of like my mom and the moments when I've seen my mom be just like so overwhelmed by instability. I grew up in San Francisco and like it really hit home. And another family that I grew up partially living with and was really close to was evicted when I was in high school. And like the mom of that family also, like just these moments where it felt like you cannot pack up everything and feed your kids and fight your eviction and go to your job and sleep at night. Like it is just too much for one person to hold. And I think those are the moments that like this collective feels so impactful to me. And going back to what A said earlier about like, what does it mean to just believe and act like everyone is deserving of everything? And everyone is deserving of having all their needs met, and that you don't have to like have a sob story or ask somebody or grovel. You just have to say, can you help me? And yeah, a couple weeks ago, like my mom had surgery and the person that was supposed to take care of her bailed last minute. And I like asked the mutual aid group, of course, I was like, can anybody just hang out with my mom and like bring her a bowl of rice? And it's crazy to me the way that like that ask, I never would have felt comfortable asking my friends. I feel like I have really good, loving friends and like a strong community. And I never could have just texted somebody and been like, hey, can you go to my mom's house and hang out with her for 3 hours? But it felt so simple and so easy to ask that of this group of people. And it makes me think about this thing that another organizer wrote to me a long time ago, this like, I don't know, just like really thoughtful quote about sort of how hard it is to do this work. But the end of it was like, trust your gut, know that you have something to offer, and build a culture you are proud of and practice it every day with peers, mentors, and leaders that you respect also doing this work. And I think for me, it's really about that, about like building a culture that we're proud of, where people can ask anything and we will say yes and do our best. And yeah, it's funny talking about it like this because I think we always are so deep in the nitty gritty that I never take enough time to take this far of a step back and really like feel and sit with how important it is to me.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for creating this in San Francisco, which is a place that I love. And I feel like this is like the future if climate change doesn't take us all. This is the way that we make it, is through some of the things that you're talking about, like interconnectedness and doing work that brings meaning to our lives and is also about the bare necessities that people like need to get by, whether it's housing or the connection is a need in itself. What you're saying about someone in Park Merced who might need a little help because like people are fucking isolated in 2024. A lot of people are. And to get through the coming years, I feel like this is like such a model for how that actually works, how like the future works. So yeah, again, we'll restate that I hope that many people that work at organizations who are listening, like take some of this and like just fucking incorporate it into their own work. I feel like the world would be so much better for it. Anyway, I could for sure hear a million more of these stories, and I will continue to just have so many compliments that I don't have the words for right now. I wanted to ask, before I let you all go, where can people find out about the work? If you all have like an open group for meetings where people could actually show up, or of course, like people should donate directly. Like that is the best way, even though like nonprofits have sort of tricked us and like politicians for their campaigns have tricked us into thinking that the only way that our money is well spent when it comes to donating is to like have it siphoned through traditional nonprofits. This is most certainly not the case. Anyway, yeah, where can people find out more?
Yeah, so we have a general meeting, which is a space to just kind of like get to know who we are, what we do. And that is every last Thursday of the month. So the upcoming one is going to be on April 26th. And in May, it will be May 30th, again, Thursday at 6:30 p.m. And then you can sign up for the Eviction Response Network and to like get plugged into our meetings and any other like ERN related asks at tinyurl.com/SFERN sign up. You can also follow us on Instagram. Our handle is WSTA_SFERN. You can also donate to our Venmo, redistribute your funds. If you're a techie and or transplant and or have wealth privilege, give us your fucking money. You can Venmo WSTA Mutual Aid, MUTUALAID. You can also check out our sick website that is so beautiful and so colorful and is years in the works. And E was a huge part of creating this website, and it's so beautiful at sfern.org. You can find all of our contact info there, like our email and our Instagram. And so if you are down to act up with us, please come to our general meeting last Thursday of every month.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is so validating. I think we all feel I feel like this is my child that I have birthed into the world, and I'm is it thriving? And hearing you say that, it's yeah, it's doing okay. So
this is amazing. Have a good rest of the night. Thank you so much.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco, which is produced by Toshio Moronic and edited by Tofu Estolas. If you have it, please throw us a few dollars through patreon.com/sadfrancisco, which will help us pay for podcast hosting, editing, and transcriptions for the show. See you next time in Sad Francisco.